you are managing big engineering team, complex projects, products in Groupon, Microsoft and all. And you've seen everything from waterfall, because you were in Boeing too.
Yep.
And they may be the king of waterfall.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nobody did waterfall.
Yeah, like them. And from there now to Groupon, where you have a small, fast moving team.
I was on a team where you'd have a 12-foot wide specifications. And the specifications, I would write what's called a technical document that had all the APIs, all the interfaces, all the data types, what's coming in, what's coming out, so that the goal was any engineer you hire can develop it. It's so spec'd out at such a technical level that any engineer could build it. The problem is you've completely eradicated the innovation from the engineer.
Yeah.
Let me add a tip here. So the perfect engineer, in my view, is a beautiful combination of innovation on one dimension and discipline on the other, and in constant tension. I want to innovate, but I also want to have high availability, high scalability, high reliability systems. So you want a healthy tension between innovation and discipline. And I would ask each engineer of where do they fall on that continuum. Some engineers are going to be a little more on the innovation side. That's what they enjoy doing. That engineer might be a great fit for a startup, right? If you try to squeeze them into a mature company that's just discipline, or a financial application, they may be terrible and be seen as a failure.
Yeah.
You put that same person leading an innovation on a startup and they're wildly successful. So notice how the same set of skills depend on circumstance. So where you fit on that matters, and make a decision. In other words, if I'm more about discipline than innovation, how can I make myself more aware of things that go on in the industry so I can come up with ideas? On the other hand, if I'm too innovation, I may not ship. So how do I become reasonably disciplined so I become a balanced engineer that has a mix of those? And in fact, I would argue project to project, you move that a little bit. But here's the thing, imagine if an engineer understands the way that they think and can adjust and say, you know what, this is an innovation project. Here's my chance to shine in terms of bringing up new ideas. Oh, this is a financial project. It has to be perfect in the MVP. The very first version must be perfect because maybe it's got tax laws and stuff like that. So there's very little wiggle room there. So here I need to be much more disciplined and rigorous, or like I'm using extreme user volume, millions of users a second, that type of thing. I might need extreme discipline. But on the other hand, I might have a project where it's all about innovation. So knowing, again, it's all about knowing yourself. Where do you land on that continuum?
So you are agile there, also changing your everything. So that was my question actually. So what engineering best practices you follow? And out of all this experience, you must have distilled few of the things which you don't compromise on.
Well, the first thing I would say is that everything that's old is new again. What I see is things, I won't mention any names, but I see things renamed that we were doing 40 years ago. So I see things that we were taking for granted and doing agilely 40 years ago that are now renamed, and now it's somehow novel. But you know what? Originally I was kind of critical of that, just renaming something, but there is an advantage to renaming. And the advantage is that it's then seen as new, and it may not have as much baggage coming along with it that you'll get if you use the term that you used to use. So for me, I do love Scrum because it sort of says, look, we want to have a goal. We want to have something output. We want to hold ourselves accountable to some minimal level of output. Okay, so I do tend to like Scrum. I do Scrum with a twist, which is my teams are business focused. We're not technology for technology. We're business first, technology second. And in doing that, what we do is we also realize, because it's kind of a fast moving company and things move around, we also are willing to move things around within a sprint. Now that seems a little crazy, but sometimes it matters. Sometimes there's a priority. So the order of the items in the sprint, I tell the PMs you can move those orders. As long as the developer hasn't started working on a particular task yet, you can move the order, just work with the developer, move the order and say, you know what, I need this fix in quicker than other fixes. I can't wait till the end of the sprint cycle. Please do it now. And off you go. Now notice we're not rescoping the sprint, we're just resequencing the sprint.
I'm just wondering, do you follow the Kanban method or Scrum, or you have your own mix
I would say it's a hybrid between Scrum with little Kanban within the Scrum. So in other words, it's Scrum overall because it gives you a little bit of structure, a little bit of organization, which I love that part of it, right? You sort of do the stands in some fashion, you know. I'm not a purist on this. What it's about is, can you have meaningful deliveries that make a difference on your business on your Scrum intervals? In other words, can you see some output that somebody cares about that matters, that you can say, you know what, our last 2 weeks were well done, there was a good value, there was something to be benefit. But I'll give you an idea where I'll be flexible. I love retros, because retros combined with Scrum gets you this continuously improving process over time where you just keep getting better and better and better. However, I'm not doing retros in the last few months.
Ah.
Now, why? Right now, the amount of work that we have in front of us is very, very heavy, and we have a relatively small team doing it. So the amount of work is very, very heavy. If I bring retros in, I'm going to create false expectations of improvements that we're not going to actually make because they require work, they require investment. And we're so strapped at the moment to finish the work that's in front of us, it's not the right time to do retros. Right. Now, when we hit a little more stable state, which I'm expecting toward the end of the year, early next year, we'll bring back in retros. I've also sort of eased up on sprint points. I'm more of number of tasks to get done because you take a lot of time to come up with those sprint points. A lot of debate goes on in those sprint points, and I love sprint points because it certainly is a useful measure of output. So you want to look at, I look at each thing in the process and say, what's the value add? And if the value add is greater than what it costs you to do the work, then do it. But be willing to make modifications. I think that's the thing is that you sort of have a framework, right, and then you adjust to optimize what's most important. And for me, for us, it's business output. What's the most features we can deliver with quality in the least amount of time with the size of team that we have.
Okay.
Because think about it, you're always saying, what is my statement of work? What is my manpower? And what's my schedule? You know, those are sort of the dimensions that you have to play with. Typically, you know, you can't move the manpower very fast because you have to have ramped manpower. So it's not just another developer, it's a ramped developer if you're working in a domain that requires expertise.
Right.
So you're not going to be able to move that much, which means the movable part really is the statement of work.
Right.
Really the statement of work controls it. So when we talk to our program manager, product managers, we say, well, you know, what do you want in what sequence? And people don't like to prioritize because they're giving something up. But you want to get people to get comfortable prioritizing. And I'll share one other story that I filled in as a surrogate PM in my early days of Microsoft, and I was terrible. So I'm a person who has deep respect for program managers. I can say the happiest day of my life was when I got dedicated program management at Microsoft. That people that do this for a profession. So to me, the engineering job is the most fun, and I think the easiest job. I hate to say that, but in my opinion, because there's so much joy. I love engineering.
Yep, I agree with you.
Program management, when done well, is a painful, thankless job that has to be done. It is difficult, and you're not a hero doing it.
Right.
And so I love being the hero. You know, the developers are the heroes, right?
Yes, yes.
The program managers are the goats. They're having to share the hard, it's a tough job that has to be done. And so here's what I did when I was program managing, so you guys can laugh at this a little bit. So my biggest issue with development is doing work that gets thrown away. It's intolerable. Of all the things you say, I'm not very rigorous on anything. I tend to be flexible, except for building stuff that doesn't ship. Everybody loses when you build capability, and it's inexcusable. It's inexcusable, especially with Sprint, where you're doing everything every couple of weeks or so, to build software that never ships. Why did you build it? You got a serious prioritization problem. So what I did is, I said, you know what? We're only doing P0 work. And so I remember some VPs, this is in an early era, so VPs sitting in the room, and I would list all the P0s we're working on. And then I would talk, you know, and then I stopped at the end of the P0s. And I remember one of the VPs going, well, when are you getting to the P1s and P2s? When they become P0s. The issue was prioritization, prioritization, prioritization. People don't like to prioritize. They don't like to compromise. That's the job. That's really the variable you control. Developers usually don't. Developers can do great work. Typically, when they're struggling, it's all about the management. It's almost never about the engineers. If you really root cause it, it's all about the leadership, and usually it's about lack of vision and lack of prioritization.
True.
Prioritize, because if you prioritize, you can get a lot of output on the right features. The most disaster is to build good work and not have a ship. No business value, no benefit. And you know, you demoralize your team, and the next time you need them to put in extra effort, you're not going to get it.
Yes.
Because they wasted their time. So prioritization is everything.
I agree with you. So I want to know another thing about, you know, because people often talk about in Agile, we are doing Agile, so there's no need for any kind of documentation and all. Where do you stand on the documentation in an Agile way of doing things in terms of, you know, what functional spec, tech spec, BRD we should have?
You got to look and see what the nature of the software is, which is, how long is the feature going to last? What's the life cycle of the software? How many generations beyond you are going to have to maintain it over how long a period of time?
Right.
If we're building software that's kind of an innovation case that we're sort of trialing out, then you're much more willing to make compromises and to shortcut the documentation. But if you're building something that needs to last, or financial software that you've got to be able to be audited on, you have to have the documentation, because what documentation is, some level of documentation. And the code is not enough. It's certainly better with modern languages, but it's generally not enough. You at least need a context diagram. The sort of the minimum level documentation would be a context diagram
True.
of how a system fits in and what are the interfaces to other systems. If you've got that, then an engineer that's trying to ramp has an idea of what's going on. If you don't do that, think about how much you're killing them off in the ramp time. In other words, the ability to bring another engineer on to help you out is vastly compromised. The other dimension would be, what's the complexity of the business domain? If you're in a domain that ends up being pretty complex and a pretty heavy ramp, for example, when I joined Groupon, I didn't know supply chain logistics. That's an empire of its own. That's a big ramp.
Right.
And so the documentation on what had been done and what was known was very helpful. Now, when you don't have a lot of documentation, I love video. So what you do is you get the experts in a room and you get your questions together and you just start you take video and video and video. So
That's
we make
true.
very heavy use of video as opposed to written documentation.
I agree with you. I'm seeing in myself, in my company itself, we are moving to a lot of recording the meetings and just posting that in place of writing a lot of documentation.
Yes, because you're doing both at the same time and it's a better media for somebody to understand. So I'll give you an example. We had an engineer that was leaving that's a tremendous engineer, been there like 7-8 years, had deep domain expertise. We had 25 recorded sessions with that engineer in the 2 weeks before he left the company.
Right.
And that was to capture the knowledge. If we were trying to do that in writing, we would have gotten 1%. We probably got 80% coverage, and we feel very comfortable, even though he was deep expert by doing the videos. And then we watched them back. So it's not enough to just do them. You actually have to invest the time to watch them back and to learn something from it. But that's the way you capture the knowledge for eternity. If you don't, the videos to me is a great alternative to a bunch of written documentation, but given a choice, I'd love an architecture diagram. Or if you're going to do a major design change, it's nice to see what's the old design, what's the new design, and how do we get there. Because without the documentation, or at least some diagram, at least a diagram of how these things work, how do you get real input from other people that don't know the domain?
Exactly.
If they can understand the domain, at least conceptually, they may be able to offer something to your design, and you're going to end up with a better system than you would if you do it. You always get better systems if you have the larger number of voices, the better systems you get.
Yep.
And the more diversity, the more differences among the people, the different backgrounds they have, the more feedback you get, the better solutions you get. So you need enough to be able to ramp the next generation. It also matters how much turnover you're getting. If you're at a company that happens to be experiencing a lot of turnover, you better have a lot more documentation than you would need if you have stability over many years. If the people are around, if the domain expertise sticks around together over long periods of time, the value of the documentation isn't the same. But if they're turning over, it becomes priceless. True. So again, notice I'm saying you always have to have it with a purpose. Notice I'm not saying lots or poor is right. What's the right sizing of the documentation?
And what
artifacts do you need for the use cases that you have and the nature of the business you're in?
True.
And you should be able to say, you know what, I've protected this company for the next decade. Whoever succeeds, in other words, always be thinking about your replacement. Who's going to replace your engineers? Who's going to replace you? Are you making the world a better place for them coming in to make it easier for them to ramp, understand, master, and then add value quickly? If you're not doing that, then you're stealing from the next generation.
True.
You've got to make an easier path for the next generation than it was for you. And when you do that, when you leave a company, you can leave with a clean conscience. True. You want to leave a company better than when you joined it. And that's something I've always taken deadly serious, that you always want, especially in this era, everybody's interconnected. If you leave a company and you burn some bridges, those people are going to remember you, and that's going to disrupt your career later on, because they'll tell all their friends, and the world is so interconnected now, somebody finds out. Imagine if you flip it and say, I always say to the person, the most important thing you ever do in your career is the transition when you leave a job.
Yes.
The transition is everything. You want to make it like you were never there. Because how do they remember you? They're like, this dude came in, protected us, took care of the company, transitioned seamlessly, trained the new staff. It was like they never left.
Yeah.
And they look at you, and they'll remember that for eternity. They'll tell all their friends 20 years in the future, when you need that serious job and you need that voter in your corner, they're going to be there for you, because they're going to say, you know what, they took care of me. And that's an integrity issue for me. You've taken care of the company. You've not left it in bad shape. You've left it in better shape than when you joined.
True, agreed, completely agree.